Once upon a time, in a faraway kingdom, there was a beautiful young princess named Snow White. Her skin was as white as snow, her lips as red as blood, and her hair as black as ebony. She was loved by all who knew her, but her stepmother, the queen, was jealous of her beauty. The queen had a magical mirror that she would often ask, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror would always reply, "You, my queen, are the fairest of them all." This made the queen happy, for she was very proud of her beauty. However, as Snow White grew older, she became more and more beautiful. One day, when the queen asked the mirror, it replied, "My queen, you are the fairest here. It's true, but Snow White, the young princess, is fairer still." This answer made the queen very angry. She could not bear to have anyone more beautiful than her. Determined to rid herself of Snow White, the queen ordered her huntsman to take Snow White into the forest and kill her. But the huntsman, who was kind-hearted, could not bring himself to harm the innocent princess. Instead, he let Snow White go and told her to run far away, never to return to the palace. Snow White, frightened and alone, wandered through the dark forest. After a long journey, she came across a small cottage. She knocked on the door, but no one answered. When she entered the cottage, she found that it belonged to 7 little dwarfs. They worked as miners, digging for gems in the mountains, and they were kind-hearted and generous. The dwarfs welcomed Snow White into their home and promised to protect her from the queen. Snow White, feeling safe and cared for, lived with the dwarfs happily. Every day, she would clean the cottage, cook meals, and sing songs. She quickly became very fond of the dwarfs, and they grew to love her like a sister. Meanwhile, the queen had discovered that Snow White was still alive. She consulted her magic mirror once more. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" the queen asked. The mirror replied, "You, my queen, are the fairest here. It's true, but Snow White, the young princess, is fairer still." The queen was furious. She knew she had to find a way to get rid of Snow White once and for all. Using her dark magic, she disguised herself as an old woman and created a poisoned apple. She knew that if Snow White ate the apple, she would fall into a deep sleep from which she could never awaken. The queen set off for the cottage, determined to trick Snow White. When she arrived, Snow White was alone, for the dwarfs had gone to work in the mines. The queen, disguised as the old woman, knocked on the door and offered Snow White the poisoned apple. "Take a bite, dear child," the queen said, her voice sweet and tempting. "This apple will grant you eternal happiness." Snow White, not suspecting any harm, took the apple and took a bite. Immediately, she collapsed to the ground, her body cold and lifeless. The queen laughed wickedly as she left the cottage, believing that she had finally rid herself of her rival. When the dwarfs returned home, They were heartbroken to find Snow White lying motionless on the floor. They wept and tried everything they could think of to wake her, but nothing worked. Snow White was in a deep sleep, and they feared she would never wake up. They placed her in a glass coffin, hoping that one day a miracle might happen. For many days, they stood by her side, mourning their beloved Snow White. One day, a prince who had heard of Snow White's beauty and kindness came to the cottage. He had fallen in love with her from afar and could not bear to see her like this. He knelt beside her coffin and kissed her gently on the lips. To everyone's amazement, Snow White's eyes fluttered open. The kiss of true love had broken the spell, and Snow White was awake once more. The dwarfs were overjoyed, and Snow White was so happy to see them all again. The prince, who had long admired Snow White from afar, asked her to marry him. Snow White, smiling, said yes, and they were soon married in a grand ceremony. As for the wicked queen, her jealousy and wickedness were her undoing. When she asked her magic mirror once more, it replied, "You are fair, my queen, but Snow White is fairer still." Enraged, the queen tried to stop the wedding, but in the end, her evil deeds caught up with her, and she was never seen again. Snow White and the prince lived happily ever after, and the seven dwarfs continued to live in their cozy cottage, always remembered as the brave and loving friends who had helped Snow White find her way to true happiness. After Snow White was revived by the prince's kiss, the entire kingdom was filled with joy. The news spread quickly, and people came from far and wide to celebrate the miraculous return of the beautiful princess. The dwarfs, who had been so heartbroken, were now overjoyed to see Snow White smiling once again. They danced and sang, celebrating her return to life. Snow White was grateful to the dwarfs for their kindness and friendship. They had shown her love and care when she was all alone in the world, and she would never forget their loyalty. As a token of her gratitude, Snow White invited the dwarfs to the royal palace, where they were treated as honored guests. They dined in the grand hall, and Snow White made sure they were given the finest food and drink. The dwarfs were amazed by the beauty and splendor of the palace, but they were most touched by Snow White's kindness. They had always been humble, living simple lives in their little cottage, but now they felt like part of the royal family. As Snow White and the prince grew closer, their love for one another deepened. The prince, who had been searching for Snow White for so long, knew that she was the one he was meant to be with. He had fallen in love with her kind heart and gentle nature, and her beauty only made his love for her grow stronger. Snow White, too, had come to love the prince. He was brave, kind, and had a noble spirit. He had been the one to rescue her from the evil spell, and his kiss had brought her back to life. Snow White knew that she had found her true love, and she was happy to spend the rest of her life with him. After the wedding, Snow White and the prince ruled the kingdom together. They were wise and fair rulers, loved by all their people. The kingdom flourished under their leadership, And Snow White was known throughout the land as the kind and compassionate queen. The dwarfs continued to live in their cottage, although now they often visited the palace. Snow White would invite them to royal events, and they became beloved figures in the kingdom. People admired the dwarfs for their hard work and loyalty, and they were always treated with the utmost respect. One day, Snow White and the prince decided to take a long journey to visit the neighboring kingdom. They traveled for days, exploring new lands and meeting new people. Along the way, they encountered many challenges, but they faced them all with courage and determination. Snow White and the prince's love for one another only grew stronger as they navigated the trials of the road together. On their journey, they visited a distant village where the people had heard of the prince and his beautiful princess. The villagers were curious to meet them, and they welcomed Snow White and the prince with open arms. The villagers invited them to a grand feast in their honor, where they were treated like royalty. Snow White and the prince enjoyed the festivities, but they were also touched by the kindness and hospitality of the villagers. During their travels, Snow White and the prince learned many valuable lessons about the world. They saw the struggles of ordinary people and the challenges they faced in their daily lives. Snow White, with her kind heart, was moved by the plight of the poor and promised to help them in any way she could. The prince,
Two.
vowed to use his position to improve the lives of the people in the kingdom. Upon their return to the palace, Snow White and the prince implemented many changes to help the people. They built schools to provide education for all the children, no matter their social standing. They created programs to provide food and shelter for those in need. The kingdom grew even more prosperous, and Snow White and the prince became known as the most benevolent rulers in the land. But as the years passed, Snow White began to wonder about the fate of her stepmother, the evil queen. She had heard whispers that the queen's jealousy and hatred had caused her own downfall. Snow White, though she had every reason to hate her stepmother, felt a sense of pity for her. After all, the queen had once been her mother's friend, and Snow White had been raised in the palace for many years before her stepmother's cruelty had driven her away. One day, Snow White asked the prince to take her to the old castle where the queen had once ruled. The prince was hesitant, fearing that the queen might still harbor ill will toward Snow White, but he agreed to accompany her. Together, they traveled to the castle, which had long since fallen into disrepair. The once magnificent building was now crumbling, with ivy growing over the walls and the windows shattered. Inside the castle, they found the queen's old mirror, which still glowed with a faint magical light. Snow White, filled with both curiosity and a sense of closure, approached the mirror.
Mirror.
"Mirror on the wall," she said softly, "is the queen still the fairest of them all?" The mirror, its magic now fading, answered in a hollow voice, "The queen is gone, and with her, her jealousy. You, Snow White, are the fairest of them all, not in beauty alone, but in kindness and love." Snow White was saddened by the mirror's words, but she also felt a sense of peace. She had forgiven the queen for all the harm she had caused, knowing that hatred would only poison her heart. Snow White had learned that true beauty comes from within, and that love and compassion were far more important than outward appearances. Returning to the palace, Snow White and the prince continued their reign with wisdom and grace. They had learned many lessons along their journey, and they were committed to making the world a better place for all their people. Snow White, with her gentle heart and loving spirit, became a beacon of hope and kindness for everyone around her.
And so,
Snow White, the prince, and the seven dwarfs lived happily ever after, their lives filled with love, laughter, and a deep sense of gratitude for the kindness they had received and shared with others.